Imagine living in, like, the absolute golden age of the British Empire.
Right. We're talking the late 19th century here.
Exactly, the late 19th century. You are in the wealthiest, most technologically advanced nation on the planet. I mean, they are building ironclad ships, laying railways across the globe. They are the undisputed engine of the Industrial Revolution.
A total powerhouse.
Yeah. But if you live in one of these booming cities, every single time you walk into your kitchen, and turn the tap to fill a glass with drinking water, you are playing a lethal game of roulette.
Literally risking your life.
With your life and your children's lives. And it's this profound historical contradiction, right? Because you have this absolute pinnacle of wealth, but the most basic element of human survival is actively killing the workforce.
Water. Just water.
Yeah, water. And here is the fact that it just shatters everything we are usually taught about how to solve a crisis like that.
Well, the efficiency argument.
Right. Because we're always told the free market is the ultimate answer to inefficiency. The invisible hand optimizes everything.
That's the standard textbook narrative.
But in 19th century England, taking the urban water plants out of the hands of private, profit-driven companies, like literally taking private property and handing it over to the government, instantly caused the death rate of a deadly plague to plummet by nearly 20%.
Almost a fifth of the fatalities. Wiped out.
Just gone.
Yeah, by changing the name on the property deed from a private corporation to a municipal government.
It is insane. So, welcome to this deep dive. If you're joining us, your mission today is to unpack an absolute titan of historical research. We are diving into a National Bureau of Economic Research working paper, number 22553.
And the title is, Who Should Own and Control Urban Water Systems? Historical Evidence from England and Wales.
Right. And it's by 3 economists, Brian Beach, Werner Troesken, and Nicola Tynan.
And, we should probably establish right away the sheer gravity of what these 3 actually accomplished.
Oh, yeah. The data set is wild.
It is. I mean, they didn't just read a few old Victorian diaries and call it a day. They spent decades doing this grueling archival detective work. They reconstructed a mortality database covering over 600 registration districts across England and Wales.
600 districts?
Yeah, and an unbroken timeline from 1869 all the way to 1910.
So they essentially built a time machine out of death certificates.
That's exactly what it is. And they matched that database with the construction and ownership records of more than 500 individual waterworks.
Which means, for you listening to this, what we're going to explore isn't just like a collection of historical anecdotes. It is an airtight, mathematically proven analysis of what happens when the drinking water of an entire city is controlled by a private contract.
Does private capital bring a miracle of efficiency? Or does it bring a silent disaster? That's the core question.
Right. And to really grasp why this study is so face-slapping, we have to look at the landscape of Britain before 1860, because it was a uniquely privatized world.
Highly privatized.
So paint that picture for us. If I'm living in, say, Manchester in 1850, who is piping the water to my house?
Statistically, a private company. Prior to 1860, nearly 70% of all British waterworks were entirely private enterprises.
70%? Wow.
Yeah, and the British government, and the public for that matter, they were incredibly proud of this system. They viewed it as the ultimate triumph of free market capitalism.
Yeah.
It was supposed to be decentralized, competitive, totally market-driven.
Okay, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. The infrastructure keeping millions of people alive wasn't viewed as a public right. It was just a consumer product, like buying coal or a shirt.
That is the exact legal framework. And because it's a private enterprise, the fundamental overriding nature of that company is profit maximization.
Which brings up a really important concept from the paper.
Right, the idea of the residual claimant.
Yeah, let's break that down mechanically, because I've heard that term in finance, but what does being a residual claimant actually do to a person's decisions?
Think of it as, well, who gets to keep the leftovers? In a private firm, the shareholders are the residual claimants. Once the company pays its workers, buys the coal to run the steam pumps, pays the interest on its debts, whatever money is left in the vault belongs to the shareholders.
The profit.
Exactly. Therefore, those shareholders have an immense structural incentive to keep operating costs as low as humanly possible. Every pound they don't spend on the waterworks goes directly into their pockets as a dividend.
Right. So if I'm a major shareholder, my residual claim is cold hard cash. I'm sitting in a boardroom and my engineers come to me and say, hey, we really need to install this new, super expensive sand filtration system.
And your first question as a shareholder is going to be what?
Will people pay more for the water if we do that?
And the answer was no. You generally couldn't easily raise the rates, so that expensive filtration system just eats directly into your profit margin.
But wait, surely the market punishes them, right? Like if a restaurant serves bad food, people stop going. If the water company serves bad water, don't the customers just buy from the competitor across town?
Well, you're hitting on the exact flaw in the Victorian mindset there. Water is a natural monopoly.
Oh, right. You can't have 5 different companies digging up the same street.
Exactly. You can't lay 5 different sets of competing water mains to your house. The infrastructure costs are astronomical. So the citizens were captured consumers. They had to buy the water the local company provided, no matter how dirty it was.
And this incentive structure just violently collided with the greatest demographic shift in human history.
Industrial Revolution.
Yes. The cities were exploding.
People were flooding in from the countryside for factory jobs. It was unprecedented, chaotic urbanization.
And let's talk about what that actually looked like on the ground. Because it wasn't, neat rows of new suburban houses being built.
Oh no, it was slums. Hastily constructed, densely packed tenement buildings with virtually no sanitation.
And as these cities expanded at this terrifying rate, the private water companies hit an impossible wall.
Capital constraints.
Right, because expanding a water network is incredibly capital intensive. You have to lay miles of heavy iron pipes, build massive new reservoirs.
And remember, borrowing money in the 1860s for a private company is expensive. You don't have the backing of the national treasury.
So the company is looking at these exploding slums and realizing that running pipes to a massive population of impoverished factory workers just isn't going to yield a high return on investment.
So they delayed. The capital constraints pushed them to just wait. They delayed laying new pipes, and more importantly, they delayed non-revenue generating health upgrades, like those expensive sand filters.
It's like a landlord who owns an apartment building and finds a slow gas leak in the basement. Fixing it requires ripping up the foundation, which costs a fortune. But it doesn't let him charge more rent, it just brings the building back to baseline safety.
Right, it's no upside for him.
So he looks at his spreadsheet, sees it's going to ruin his quarterly profit, and just patches it with duct tape. The tenants are getting sick, but his balance sheet looks fantastic.
That analogy captures the exact incentive trap. The shareholders were totally insulated from the physical consequences of their financial decisions. So you have the most advanced industrial empire in the world paralyzed, watching its economic hubs become hotbeds for disease. The free market system was literally poisoning the workforce.
And when we say poisoning, we aren't talking about like a mild stomach bug. We are talking primarily about typhoid fever. I think we need to be really clear about the stakes here.
Oh, typhoid is a brutal disease caused by the Salmonella typhi bacteria. It causes prolonged raging fevers, severe abdominal pain, internal bleeding, delirium. And without modern antibiotics, the mortality rate is incredibly high.
But the crucial thing for this study, the grim mechanism at play, is how it spreads.
Yes, it's a waterborne disease transmitted primarily through the fecal-oral route.
Which is a very clinical way of saying
that the bacteria is shed in the feces of an infected person. And if that waste finds its way into the drinking water supply, which it constantly did in these poorly sewered cities, the next person who drinks from the tap ingests the bacteria.
I just want to pause on that for a second. The wealth of the British Empire was built by people who were, on a daily basis, drinking water contaminated with human waste.
Right.
Because the private capital model couldn't justify the expense of filtering it.
That is the stark, horrifying reality. And a reality like that cannot sustain itself. Something had to break.
Which brings us to the Great Reversal. This massive structural revolution that the paper documents. Between 1860 and 1910, that pride in the private water market completely collapsed.
The share of publicly owned waterworks spiked from roughly 40% to nearly 62%.
Yeah, it is huge. Nearly 40% of all privately built waterworks in the country were transferred to municipal governments. The private monopoly was essentially dismantled.
In just half a century.
Now, if I'm a cynical observer, I might assume the capitalists just got tired of the business. Like maybe the profits dried up and they voluntarily offloaded these failing assets to the government for a bailout. Did they just hand over the keys?
Not at all.
Yeah.
These companies were still highly profitable for their shareholders. They were paying out dividends. They did not volunteer to step down. This was a forced eviction by the state.
A legal confiscation. So how did the government pull that off? Because the British government historically respects private property rights above almost anything else.
Right. To understand how they did it, the authors point to two monumental pieces of legislation that line up perfectly with two massive spikes in government takeovers. The first is the 1875 Public Health Act, and the second is the 1894 Local Government Act.
Let's dig into that 1875 Act. What made it such a powerful weapon?
The 1875 Act was essentially a legal bulldozer. Before this, local health administration was just a tangled mess of overlapping jurisdictions and toothless committees. But this act consolidated power. It divided the country into sanitary districts and explicitly mandated that local authorities were legally responsible for ensuring an adequate, clean water supply.
So they changed the legal expectation from water is a commodity to water is a public necessity that the government is on the hook for.
Precisely. But, a mandate is useless without the power to execute it. The genius of the 1875 Act was that it gave these local sanitary districts the statutory power to force a purchase of the private water companies.
Wow.
And most crucially, it gave them access to incredibly cheap long-term financing from the central government.
Oh, this is the linchpin. Earlier we said the private companies couldn't afford to borrow money to upgrade the pipes, but the government has the ultimate collateral.
The power to tax.
Yes. So the state can issue municipal bonds at a fraction of the interest rate a private company would pay.
Exactly. So the state engineered a standard, replicable procedure for taking over these assets. And then the 1894 Local Government Act took it a step further by empowering local ratepayers, the citizens themselves, to petition directly and complain about what the legislation called the insufficiency or unwholesomeness of their water.
Unwholesomeness. That is such a politely Victorian way of phrasing something so horrific. Pardon me, sir, but there appears to be a lethal amount of raw sewage in my morning tea.
It is deeply polite, but the legal mechanism was ruthless. The national government realized that to keep the workforce alive, to keep the industrial engine running, they had to systematically strip private capital of its control. It was national self-preservation.
But wait, this raises a huge procedural question for me. If I'm a local mayor in 1880 and my citizens are complaining about unwholesome water and I want to use this act to force the private company to sell, how do I actually prove the water is bad?
That is the core dilemma of the era.
Because today, if a city wants to prove a company is violating health codes, they just send an inspector to dip a testing strip in the reservoir. They measure E. coli parts per million, put it under a microscope, and hand the judge a lab report. But in 1880...
In 1880, none of that existed. Germ theory was barely in its infancy. Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch were just starting to formalize the idea that microscopic organisms cause disease. It was not widely accepted or easily testable by a local town council. There were no chemical testing kits.
So you walk into an arbitration court to force the sale of a multi-million-pound private company, and your only evidence is that the water looks a bit cloudy. The company's lawyers would just laugh you out of the room.
They'd say the water is fine, the people in the slums are just dirty.
Which is exactly what they argued, so how did they prove it?
This brings us to the most brilliant and frankly the darkest methodological choice made by the economists writing this paper. Because there was no scientific way to measure bacteria in the water back then, the researchers needed a proxy, an objective measurable metric that perfectly correlated with fecal contamination in the water supply.
And that metric was the death toll.
Yes, the typhoid death rate. Typhoid is so specifically tied to human waste in water that the number of bodies being buried in a district was the single most accurate scientific indicator of how dirty the water company's product was.
That is just... it's chilling to think about. If you are listening to this, consider the reality of that metric. The cost of performing a water quality check in Victorian England was the death of hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. The death toll was the only dashboard the city officials had.
It's a grim reality. But for the economists writing this paper over a century later, it provided a pristine data set. They paired the construction and ownership histories of the waterworks with the annual death records of those 600 districts. They painstakingly tracked the typhoid deaths year by year, mapping them against who owned the water company at that exact time.
And the map they generated is massive. It covers practically all of England and Wales. There's no geographic bias. And the data begins to reveal this fascinating profile of which private waterworks were actually targeted for these takeovers.
Right, because the data tells a much more nuanced story than simply capitalism is evil. We love a good villain, but the reality was drove by objective math. When the researchers compared the forcibly municipalized waterworks against the ones allowed to remain private, stark differences emerged.
They weren't just picking them out of a hat. The systems that got taken over shared very specific, fatal characteristics. First, they were the oldest systems, averaging 38 years old, built way back around 1843.
But age was only half the problem. The true catalyst was demographic pressure. The districts where the government intervened were experiencing absolute demographic chaos.
The paper highlights a staggering statistic here. The population growth in these targeted districts was averaging 35.98% over a 5-year period. Let's just synthesize what that means. If you live in a city of 100,000 people, in just 5 years, nearly 36,000 new people show up. They need housing, food, and they generate an enormous amount of human waste.
The existing infrastructure would instantly buckle under that weight. Systems built in 1843 were completely overwhelmed. And this is where the financial model of the private company completely breaks down. Imagine being the executive of that company. Your system is rusting, reservoirs are too small, and suddenly your customer base expands by 36% in 5 years.
The cost of financing the upgrades for those new people laying miles of mains into new, poorly planned neighborhoods would completely overwhelm their capital reserves.
Precisely. They faced a fatal choice. Take on massive, high-interest debt to fund upgrades that won't necessarily increase the price they can charge, or do nothing, keep costs low, and keep paying out dividends while the infrastructure collapses.
And the rational economic choice, the choice dictated by private equity, was to do nothing. So it wasn't that these owners were cartoon villains actively trying to hurt people. They were just trapped in a business model that could not financially sustain public health during an unprecedented population boom. They ran out of breath trying to outpace the human flood.
And the tragic consequence of doing nothing was that the typhoid rates inevitably began to climb.
Okay, so the death toll is climbing, the company is doing nothing, the population is exploding. This leads me to what I think is one of the most counterintuitive, face-slapping findings in the entire paper. Because logically, if a massive typhoid outbreak hits a city and people are dying in the streets, the local government swoops in, seizes the water plant under the 1875 Act, and fixes the problem the very next year. Crisis creates an immediate response, right?
You would think so, but the data unequivocally says no. Current year typhoid outbreaks did not cause an immediate waterworks takeover.
This blew my mind. The researchers found that it was the typhoid rates from 1 to 5 years prior that actually predicted a government takeover. Why on earth was there a delay? If the death toll is your only proof, why wait 5 years to save your citizens?
The answer is something that plagues infrastructure projects to this day. Bureaucracy.
Oh, man.
Agonizing, labyrinthine, randomized bureaucratic nightmares. The legal arbitration required to force a private company to sell took years, sometimes decades.
The paper gives examples that are just infuriating. Like Birmingham, a massive industrial hub. The city government was authorized by Parliament to buy its waterworks in 1851. They recognized the need. But because of endless legal bickering, disputes over valuing the aging pipes, relentless arbitration over the final price, it took them 24 years to actually complete the takeover.
24 years of legal friction. In another case, the Bridlington and Quay Water Company. A purchase clause was added in 1875, but the government didn't actually manage to buy them out until 1899. Another 24-year delay.
If I'm a citizen in Birmingham during those 24 years, I am watching my neighbors die of typhoid. I know the city council wants to buy the plant, and I have to sit there and wait for a quarter of a century while lawyers in powdered wigs argue over the exact monetary depreciation value of a rusty iron pump. It is madness.
From a humanitarian perspective, yes, absolute madness. A devastating failure of administrative speed. However,
and this is where the genius of modern econometrics comes in. We all hate government red tape, but this specific, decades-long local government red tape actually provided a miracle for the economists writing this paper.
yes, it solves a massive chicken and egg problem, a concept known as resolving endogeneity.
Let's break that down without the jargon. Why is this bureaucratic delay a miracle for the data?
Okay, imagine if a city took over the waterworks the exact same year a massive typhoid epidemic hit. Epidemics, by their nature, eventually burn themselves out. The disease sweeps through, kills the vulnerable, survivors build immunity, and the next year the death rate naturally drops.
Right, like a forest fire running out of dry wood.
Exactly. The statistical term for that is mean reversion. The extreme numbers naturally revert back toward the average over time. So if the government took over the water during the peak of the fire and deaths dropped the next year, skeptics would immediately argue, the government takeover didn't save lives. That's just mean reversion. Though plague was fading away naturally, you cannot prove the change in ownership caused the drop.
Ah, I see the trap. If the action and the natural end of the crisis happen at the exact same time, you can never mathematically prove which one actually caused the cure.
But the bureaucratic delay breaks that connection perfectly. Because the lawyers argued for 5, 10, or 24 years, the actual moment the property deed transferred became completely randomized relative to the disease cycle.
So the takeover might finally happen in a year where typhoid is really high or in a year where it's relatively low. It completely disconnects the stroke of the government pen from the natural cycle of the plague.
Precisely. The administrative friction created a pristine natural experiment. It allowed researchers a century later to isolate the exact moment of the property transfer and measure its pure effect on public health, totally stripped of the natural ebb and flow of epidemics.
And when they finally measured that pure effect, the result is visually astonishing. If you look at Figure 4 in the paper, it's a graph showing the timeline of typhoid deaths relative to the year of the government takeover. And it does not look like a gentle slope, it looks like a cliff.
One of the most dramatic visual representations of a policy impact you will see. For a full decade leading up to the takeover, you see a steady, undeniable climb. The private system is failing. The water is getting deadlier year by year.
The line on the graph just creeps up, and then you hit what the researchers label year zero, the year after the government finally assumes total control. The curve doesn't just level off. It instantly breaks and plummets straight down.
The statistical models isolate that moment and show that overall, the typhoid death rate permanently dropped by 19% following municipalization.
Almost a fifth of all typhoid deaths completely wiped out. It's as if a switch was flipped. Just scratching out a private corporation's name and writing City of Birmingham on the deed saved thousands upon thousands of lives. The precision of this data gives me chills because there were no new miracle drugs invented in year zero.
No penicillin.
Right, no sudden leap in medical science. The Grim Reaper was stopped strictly and entirely inside the water pipes.
But of course, rigorous economists must anticipate every angle of attack. The authors had to ask, what if this massive drop is just a historical coincidence? What if Victorian society just experienced a sudden boom in overall health that exact same year?
Like better nutrition or less crowded housing.
Right. To definitively prove it was the water, they needed a placebo test.
Because in a clinical drug trial, you give half the patients a sugar pill to make sure the real medicine is what's working. But how do you give a sugar pill to an entire city's infrastructure? You can't give a city fake water.
No, you can't. But you can look at diseases that have absolutely nothing to do with drinking water. The researchers ran the exact same statistical models, focusing on the exact same timeline around year zero, but instead of tracking typhoid, they tracked non-waterborne causes of death.
Things like smallpox, measles, scarlet fever, typhus, whooping cough, and my personal favorite, they even tracked violence.
Which is a brilliant methodological control, because if the death rate from violence also dropped by 19% in year zero, you could logically argue, well, the city just got richer, crime went down, people were happier and healthier overall. The water takeover was just a coincidence.
But the results of this placebo test are the ultimate silent witness to the truth of this paper. The death rates for smallpox, measles, violence, they did not change at all.
Their trajectories remained completely flat and unaffected around the year of the takeover.
They didn't even blip. The data's precision is terrifying. Besides the ownership of the water, literally nothing else changed, which means the public ownership of that water was the sole and absolute antidote.
It isolates the mechanism perfectly. But the paper goes deeper into the mechanics of why the government takeover worked by looking at what they call the interactive effect.
I like to think of this as the ruins effect. Let me try an analogy. If you buy a used car that was perfectly maintained and you change the oil, the performance doesn't change much. But if you buy a rusted out wreck that hasn't seen fresh oil in 20 years and you put a new engine in it, the marginal increase in performance is explosive. Did they find something similar with the waterworks?
That is an excellent way to frame it. They didn't just look at the average 19% drop. They interacted the municipalization data with the age of the waterworks and the rate of population growth. They wanted to know if the life-saving effect was uniform across all cities or if certain types of struggling systems benefited more.
And the reality is that the magic of public ownership worked best on the systems that were rotting the most.
The statistical models, specifically tables 5 and 6, reveal a highly significant negative interaction, in plain terms. The older the waterworks was, and the higher the population growth in that specific district, the more dramatic the life-saving effect of the government takeover.
So, if a city took over a relatively new, well-built private system, Taking it over might only drop typhoid by a tiny margin. But if you had a 40-year-old system completely crushed by a 30% population boom, a true ruin taking it over caused a massive, explosive relief in the death toll.
It implies a deeply cynical reality about the end stage of those private contracts. The private owners of those desperately strained systems had essentially abandoned any pretense of upgrading them. They were extracting the final drops of revenue from a dying asset. When the government finally stepped in with fresh capital and a strict public health mandate, the turnaround was spectacular because the baseline was so abysmal.
But of course, there is always academic pushback. And the big academic pushback here goes right back to that mean reversion idea. A skeptical economist would say, look, I hear your argument about bureaucratic delays, but plagues naturally burn out over 5-year cycles. Maybe your randomized delay just happened to consistently align with the tail end of a 5-year supercycle of typhoid.
It's a valid critique, and the researchers attacked it head-on with a massive robustness check.
How do you mathematically defeat an argument like that?
You explicitly build the natural oscillation of the disease into your model. They controlled for the past 5 years of epidemic waves in every single district. They mathematically fed the historical burnout cycle into the regression to completely neutralize it. They asked the math, if we completely strip away any natural fading of the disease, does the government takeover still matter?
And the academic excuse was absolutely destroyed. Even after mathematically neutralizing the past 5 years of plagues, the pure act of government takeover still accounted for a permanent 13 to 15% drop in deaths. The proof is bulletproof. The plagues weren't naturally fading away. They were being systematically eradicated by a change in property rights.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps the most dangerous counterargument the authors had to dismantle. Let's call it the sewer conspiracy.
Oh, this is my absolute favorite part of the deep dive. Because if I were trying to debunk this paper, this is exactly where I would attack. I would have bet money that the sewers were the real hero here.
It's a very historically intuitive assumption.
Right. We always hear about the Great Sewers of London. The late 19th century was the era of the Great Sanitary Awakening. If a municipal government takes on massive public debt to buy the waterworks, isn't it entirely logical that they also start digging up the streets to build a vast underground sewer network at the exact same time?
It makes perfect logistical sense. If you have the streets torn up to lay clean water pipes, you might as well lay sewer pipes.
Exactly. And if they built sewers at the same time they bought the waterworks, then how on earth do we know the drop in typhoid was from the clean drinking water? Maybe it was just from the fact that they finally flushed the raw sewage out of the streets? If the sewers did the heavy lifting, then the entire premise of this paper totally falls apart.
To solve this, the researchers had to do some incredibly tedious, granular historical detective work. They couldn't just look at water data anymore. They had to dig into the archives of the local government board.
Tell us about these archives. What are they actually looking at?
They are looking at the loan ledgers. Every single time a local authority wanted to borrow money to build a sewer, they had to get the loan formally sanctioned by the local government board. These ledgers are incredibly detailed, handwritten records.
So they had to painstakingly transcribe and aggregate decades of local borrowing data, specifically isolating loans marked exclusively for sewer purposes.
Yes. And then they mapped that timeline of municipal sewer borrowing relative to year zero, the year of the waterworks takeover. And the resulting graph is another stunning moment of clarity.
I am looking at it, and it completely upends what I thought. For the entire decade leading up to the water takeover, and for the entire decade after the water takeover, the sewer borrowing line is essentially a flat line hovering near zero.
The governments did not start systematically borrowing money to build massive sewer projects until about 10 years after they took over the waterworks.
10 years. That is the definitive proof. The typhoid death rate plummets instantly in year zero. But the massive public financing for sewer construction doesn't systematically spike until year 10. You cannot credit a sewer for saving lives a full decade before it was actually built.
And just to be absolutely mathematically certain, the authors ran their regression models one more time, entirely stripping out the effects of any localized, overlapping sewer construction. Even when accounting for sewers, the pure act of nationalizing the drinking water still caused a 17.6% drop in deaths.
So clean water beat death all by itself. It didn't need the sewers to do the heavy lifting in those crucial early years.
And the paper provides a specific localized example that perfectly illustrates how ownership immediately dictated this purity without needing a new sewer. Let's look at the city of Nottingham.
What happened in Nottingham?
When the Nottingham municipal government finally acquired their private waterworks in 1880, they inherited a sprawling system with 5 different water sources. One of those sources was the Scotholm Waterworks,
And Scotholm was a problem.
a massive problem. It was drawing water from a groundwater source dangerously close to the River Leen, which was heavily polluted with industrial and human waste.
Okay, so a private company is running this polluted plant because it generates revenue and the sunk costs have been paid. What did the new municipal government do when they took the keys in 1880? Did they wait 10 years to build a massive sewer system to clean up the River Leen?
No. They immediately abandoned the Scotholm Waterworks for domestic supply. They literally just shut it off and shifted the entire domestic supply to cleaner sources further away.
That is the crux of the whole argument right there. A private company would almost never just shut down a functioning, revenue-generating pump station simply because it was close to a polluted river. The profit motive forbids it. But a public entity answering to local voters who are tired of watching their families die could make that decision overnight.
Changing the priority from profit to purity was the ultimate public health intervention. The ability of the government to prioritize public health over sunk capital and use cheap borrowing to absorb the loss is what drove that massive drop in mortality.
So if I'm trying to synthesize the entire journey we've just taken, we've spent this time proving with airtight, exhaustive historical data that taking water away from private companies and giving it to the government saved thousands of lives in 19th century England. The math is undeniable. So case closed, right? Nationalization of infrastructure is always a miracle. Privatization is always a disaster. We can just write the policy, apply it everywhere, and go home.
Well, if we pull back and look at the broader economic reality, it's never quite that simple. We cannot let ideology blind us to context. To understand the true lesson of this paper, we have to look at another highly famous economic study published in 2005 by Galliani, Gertler, and Shagradsky.
Okay, where did they look?
They looked at urban water systems in Argentina in the 1990s.
And what did the data show there?
It showed the exact opposite of England. The 2005 study proved, with similarly rigorous data, that in 1990s Argentina, privatizing the public water systems and handing them over to corporations dramatically lowered infant mortality, especially among the poorest communities.
Wait, hold on. That is a staggering pivot. In 19th century England, public ownership is the undisputed miracle cure. But 100 years later in Argentina, private ownership is the miracle cure. How can the fundamental laws of economics just flip completely upside down like that?
This is where we have to step entirely away from modern political camps. The data doesn't care if you lean left or right. The data only cares about governance. The answer to this contradiction lies in what I call the institutional soil.
The institutional soil. Explain what you mean by that.
You have to look at the quality, the competence, and the integrity of the entity running the show. Let's contrast the two environments. In 19th century Britain, despite all its flaws, you had highly efficient, high-quality urban governance. The state had immense administrative capacity to manage complex infrastructure. And crucially, because the British state was perceived as supremely stable, it could borrow money at much cheaper interest rates than private firms.
So the Victorian government had the administrative competence to plan the network and the cheap credit to actually pay for the pipes. They were a highly functional tool.
Precisely. Now contrast that institutional soil with 1990s Argentina. A 1996 New York Times article described the environment there by stating that payoffs, kickbacks, and government bribes are considered a part of everyday life.
I see where this is going.
In that specific environment, the public water utilities were not functioning as guardians of public health. They were crippled by massive public corruption, political patronage hiring, and chronic, desperate underinvestment due to national economic instability. The state was acting as a vehicle for political extraction, not a competent manager.
So in Argentina, the government itself was the poison, and private capital bringing in outside efficiency, strict foreign accounting standards that bypass local graft, and modern technological investment acted as the cure.
Exactly. The authors of our NBER paper conclude by explicitly stating that there is probably no general, universal answer to who should own the water. There is no ideological magic bullet. The efficacy of any ownership regime depends entirely on the broader economic and institutional setting of the society in question.
That is a profound takeaway. It means both blind privatization and blind nationalization are gambles with human lives if you ignore the actual quality of the institutions you're handing the keys to. If your government is deeply corrupt and inept, handing them a monopoly on the water supply is a death sentence for the poor. But equally, if your private market is highly constrained by capital, driven solely by short-term dividends, and lacks strict regulatory oversight, like in Victorian England, handing them a monopoly on water is also a death sentence.
It demands a clear-eyed, objective assessment of where the institutional strengths and weaknesses truly lie in any given moment in history.
This has been an incredibly dense, fascinating journey through the data. We started with the terrifying reality of Victorian slums, where every sip of water was a gamble. We watched the foundational theories of the free market fail in the face of skyrocketing urban populations, leading to the self-inflicted tragedy of the British paradox.
And we analyzed how the heady, institutional hand of the state, armed with the Public Health Act of 1875, initiated the Great Reversal, legally stripping private capital of its control over life and death.
We dug into the beautiful mistake of bureaucratic inefficiency, how the agonizing 24-year delays in legal arbitration actually provided the perfect natural experiment, allowing modern economists to use the typhoid death toll as the ultimate, undeniable proxy for water quality.
We visualized the cliff of life, that stunning 19% drop in mortality in year zero, and we validated it with the placebo test of non-waterborne diseases. We mathematically defeated the academic doubt of mean reversion and uncovered the sewer conspiracy, proving that clean water alone was the true victor in those crucial early years.
And finally, we confronted the ultimate contradiction between England and Argentina, realizing that institutional soil, the actual competence and integrity of governance, determines whether the water flows clean far more than any rigid political ideology. I want to thank you, the listener, for sticking with us and diving so deeply into this grim, complex, but deeply vital world of historical water rights.
It is a history that remains absolutely crucial to understand today.
And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've just discussed, but stretches right into our reality today. History, it seems, is not a straight line. It's a spiral. In 1989, England, the very country we just spent all this time studying, actually went back and completely privatized its water system all over again.
A complete historical reversal of the reversal.
And then, in 2010, the city of Paris stripped its private water contracts and went back to public ownership. The pendulum of ownership is still swinging back and forth across the globe. But as we face a future defined by climate change, crumbling infrastructure, and increasingly severe global water scarcity, that pendulum is swinging faster and the stakes are rising higher than ever before.
The margin for error is disappearing.
So here's my question for you. If the cycle between public and private is an endless historical loop, are we doomed to keep paying the transition costs in human lives every time we blind test a new economic theory on our most precious resource? Or can we finally learn to look at the diagnostic reality of our own institutions, our own soil, before we decide who controls the source of life? Keep questioning the infrastructure around you until the next deep dive.